It was a quiet afternoon in the lecture hall. The math teacher, Mr. Collins, was known for being strict and often enjoyed putting students on the spot. He believed it was a way to test their confidence, but sometimes it turned into a game of humiliation for those who struggled. That day his eyes fell on a woman sitting in the middle row. Her name was Clara. She was soft-spoken, rarely raised her hand, and mostly kept to herself. Mr. Collins smirked and decided to make her an example. He turned to the board and wrote out an equation that made half the class groan. It was long, complicated, and filled with twists only advanced students usually knew how to handle. He tapped the chalk against the board and then looked straight at Clara. "Why don't you solve this for us, Clara?" he said, his voice dripping with challenge. The class shifted uncomfortably. Some students smirked, others whispered under their breath. They thought Clara would stumble or freeze like many before her. But Clara calmly stood up, her notebook still open in her hands. Her eyes scanned the equation just once, and she began walking toward the board. There was no hesitation in her steps. The room fell into silence as she picked up the chalk and started writing. Her hand moved quickly yet gracefully, each line of work flowing into the next. At first the students were confused. She skipped unnecessary steps and cut straight to the core of the problem. Numbers and symbols connected with a precision that even some of the top students struggled to follow. Mr. Collins leaned on his desk, his smirk fading as the solution unfolded before him. The whispers in the classroom grew louder this time, not mocking, but filled with awe. Could she really be solving it so easily, they wondered. Clara stopped at the final line of the equation, circled her answer, and placed the chalk back neatly on the ledge. Then she turned to face the teacher, her calm expression unchanged. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, a student in the back let out a low whistle, followed by a burst of whispers. "Did she just do that?" someone whispered. "That was perfect," another added in shock. Mr. Collins cleared his throat, walked up to the board, and carefully checked her work. His eyes narrowed as he traced every line, but the answer was flawless. Not only was it correct, but she had solved it in a way that was elegant and efficient. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. The entire class sat frozen, waiting for his reaction. Clara, however, stood quietly, her notebook still in her hands, her posture relaxed, as though nothing unusual had happened. The silence in the room grew heavier until finally the teacher spoke. Mr. Collins' voice was quieter now, but it carried across the room. "This is correct," he said, every step precise, every answer flawless. The students gasped, some leaning forward in their seats, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Clara simply gave a small nod, as if she had only done something ordinary. But to the rest of the class, it was anything but ordinary. One of the top students, Mark, whispered to his friend, "I spent hours last night stuck on something half this hard. And she just solved it like it was nothing." Others nodded in disbelief, their eyes glued to Clara. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and looked at her again, with something the students had never seen before: respect. He tried to maintain his authority, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Clara walked back to her seat quietly, the eyes of the entire classroom following her. The whispers turned into quiet murmurs of admiration. It was no longer about embarrassment, it was about realization. They had all underestimated her. The quiet woman who never raised her hand had just shown a level of brilliance none of them expected. And in that moment, Clara sat down, opened her notebook again, and simply listened as if nothing had happened. But the class could not stop staring at her. Even Mr. Collins paused more often than usual, his mind still on the equation and the woman who had solved it with ease. The lesson continued, but the energy in the room was different. Clara had shifted something. A silent strength had revealed itself, and it left everyone shaken and amazed. When the bell finally rang, the students hurried out, still whispering about Clara. Some glanced back at her as if she had suddenly become someone entirely new in their eyes. Clara, however, moved at her usual calm pace, gathering her books and walking toward the door. Mr. Collins called out to her before she could leave the room. "Clara, a word, please." She turned and waited quietly, her eyes steady but calm. Mr. Collins walked closer, lowering his voice so the other students could not hear. "Where did you learn to solve like that?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Clara hesitated for just a moment before answering softly, "My father used to teach me when I was young. He believed understanding was more important than memorizing." Mr. Collins studied her face, searching for any sign of pride or arrogance, but there was none. Only quiet confidence. "You should not hide talent like that," he said. "Finally, students like you could inspire others." Clara gave him a small smile, but said nothing more before leaving the classroom. As she stepped into the hallway, a few students were waiting nearby, pretending to linger at their lockers. One of them, Mark, the top student, walked up to her looking both nervous and impressed. "Clara, that was unbelievable," he admitted. "I have never seen anyone solve that fast. Could you maybe help me study sometime?" Clara looked at him with gentle eyes and nodded. "If you want, I can help." Word of what happened spread quickly through the school. By the next day, students who barely noticed Clara before were suddenly treating her differently. Some approached her with questions about assignments, while others simply watched her in quiet admiration. But Clara remained the same, soft-spoken, steady, and humble. Even when people began to whisper stories about her brilliance, she never raised her voice or tried to draw attention to herself. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, seemed more thoughtful in his lessons. He no longer called on students just to embarrass them, and when he spoke, there was a new measure of respect in his tone. It was as though Clara had taught him as much as she had taught the class. Days turned into weeks, and Clara continued to surprise people with her quiet strength. She solved problems when no one else could. She explained concepts in simple ways that even struggling students could understand. Yet she always carried herself with the same quiet humility. And every time she stepped into the classroom, the air seemed to shift, as if everyone knew they were sitting near someone extraordinary. Soon Clara found herself surrounded by classmates who actually wanted to sit near her instead of leaving her alone at the edge of the room. She never asked for attention, yet somehow it followed her everywhere she went. During lunch one afternoon, a group of students sat with her, asking questions not only about math but about life and the way she thought through things. Clara listened patiently, giving answers in her soft, calm tone, never making anyone feel small for not knowing what she knew. Even Mark, who had always carried himself with confidence, began deferring to her in class, waiting to see how she would approach a problem before giving his own solution. Mr. Collins noticed this shift too. He realized the class was learning more from Clara's way of explaining than from his lectures alone. Instead of feeling threatened, he began to invite her to the board to show her methods. At first, Clara hesitated, not wanting the spotlight, but slowly she agreed, and her quiet, steady voice filled the room with clarity. The more she spoke, the more her classmates leaned in, eager to catch every word. Outside of class, rumors about her talent spread even further. Students from other grades came to see if the stories were true, and some even brought problems from advanced textbooks, hoping she could solve them. Clara never boasted and never dismissed a question, no matter how simple or complex. She treated every problem as though it mattered. As days passed, the teachers in other subjects began to notice her too. She was not only skilled in mathematics, but her ability to observe, listen, and respond with patience made her stand out in every lesson. By the time midterms arrived, the entire school seemed to know her name. But Clara still walked the halls quietly, with her books pressed close to her chest, as if nothing had changed. What others saw as genius, Clara simply saw as the way she had been taught to think by her father in the quiet evenings of her childhood. And though the world around her was changing, Clara remained the same humble, steady woman she had always been. One afternoon after class, Mr. Collins asked Clara to stay behind. He closed the door gently and looked at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Clara," he said, "I have been teaching for many years, but I have never seen a student with your ability." Clara lowered her gaze, clutching her notebook tightly. "I just do what I know," she replied softly. Mr. Collins shook his head with a smile. "No, Clara, you do more than that. You inspire others to see problems differently. That is rare." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. It was the principal, Mrs. Green. She stepped inside, her sharp eyes softening when she saw Clara. "Mr. Collins, I need to borrow Clara for a moment," she said. Clara followed the principal down the long hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. They entered the principal's office, where several unfamiliar faces were waiting. Among them was a professor from the local university. He studied Clara with great interest and asked her to solve a complex equation written on a board at the side of the room. Clara hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Green, who gave her an encouraging nod. She stepped forward, chalk in hand, and began writing slowly, methodically. Her hand moved with steady confidence, filling the board with neat, precise steps. Minutes later, she placed the chalk down and turned silently. The room was still until the professor let out a long breath and said, "Incredible." Mrs. Green's lips curved into a proud smile. "Clara, do you realize what you have just done? You solved a problem most of my graduate students struggle with." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, her calm face betraying no pride, only quiet acceptance. The professor leaned forward. "Clara, I would like to invite you to the university. We have programs for gifted individuals like yourself." Clara glanced down at her notebook, hugging it close. Once more, the thought of leaving her quiet world unsettled her, but deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of something far greater. Clara sat quietly in the principal office while the others kept whispering among themselves. Mrs. Green finally spoke. "Clara, we know this is sudden, but opportunities like this do not come often." The professor added, "You would not be alone, Clara. We would guide you step by step. You could work on mathematics at a level far beyond the school." Clara held her notebook tighter, her thoughts spinning. She had never wanted attention, never wanted the spotlight, yet here she was with everyone waiting for her answer. Mr. Collins, who had followed into the office, stepped forward and spoke gently. "Clara, sometimes life chooses us for things we do not expect. You have a gift, and the world deserves to see it." Clara lifted her eyes to him, his words settled in her heart. She remembered the classroom earlier that day, how the students had watched her with awe, not out of mockery, but out of respect. Her lips parted slowly. "I will try." The room seemed to breathe again. Mrs. Green nodded firmly. "Good, that is all we ask." The professor smiled warmly. "Excellent, Clara. We will arrange everything for you to visit the university soon." As Clara left the office with her notebook pressed against her chest, she felt the weight of change pressing in around her. She had lived so long in quiet shadows, but now doors she never imagined were opening before her. In the hallway, some students were still gathered, whispering. They fell silent as Clara passed. A few even smiled shyly at her for the first time. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she walked forward, steady and calm, knowing that her life had shifted into something far greater than she had ever imagined. Days passed, and the news spread quickly across the school. Students who once overlooked Clara now glanced at her with curiosity and even admiration. Some approached her at lunch, asking if she could explain certain problems they struggled with. Clara at first hesitated, but then found herself enjoying the quiet moments of helping others, showing them step by step how to see patterns they had missed. Mr. Collins noticed the change, too. He no longer looked at Clara with doubt, but with genuine respect. He even asked her to assist him in preparing lessons for the class. One afternoon, Clara was called into the library where the university professor was waiting again. He placed a stack of advanced books on the table and smiled. "These are for you, Clara. They are not simple, but I know you can handle them." Clara touched the worn covers, her fingers trembling slightly. She had never owned books like these before. They felt like keys to a hidden world. The professor leaned closer. "Do not let anyone convince you that you are less than brilliant, Clara. You have something rare, and it must be nurtured." As Clara walked home that evening, the sun dipped low, painting the streets gold. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, her heart filled with both fear and excitement. She wondered what her parents would say, how her quiet evenings solving problems in secret would now be replaced by new challenges and expectations. But deep inside, Clara felt a growing strength. She had faced humiliation in front of her class and turned it into respect. Now she was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Clara walked into class and noticed how the atmosphere had shifted. Students who once ignored her now whispered her name with a kind of awe. Even the ones who had laughed the loudest when Mr. Collins tried to embarrass her now avoided making jokes in her direction. Clara kept her head down, but inside, she felt a quiet fire. It was not pride, but something stronger, a belief that she could finally step out of the shadows. Mr. Collins greeted the class with his usual stern tone, but when his eyes landed on Clara, his expression softened. He asked her a question, not to mock, but to genuinely seek her insight. Clara explained her reasoning clearly and patiently. As the room grew silent, Every word she spoke was absorbed by the class, and even Mr. Collins nodded with approval. After class, one of the students named Eric caught up to her in the hallway. He was known as one of the brightest in mathematics, but his voice carried sincerity when he said, "Clara, I never understood half of what Mr. Collins taught until I heard you explain it. You make things clear." Clara smiled shyly and continued on her way, but the words stayed with her. Later that day, the professor visited again. He invited Clara to join a small circle of students outside the school who worked on advanced problems together. It was an opportunity few ever received. Clara hesitated, but the thought of finally exploring the world of numbers without limits stirred something in her heart. She agreed. That evening she sat at her desk, lit by the dim glow of a small lamp. Her pencil moved quickly across the page, filling it with lines of symbols and solutions. For the first time, Clara did not feel like the quiet, overlooked girl in class. She felt like someone stepping into her true self, and the journey ahead was only beginning. As the days passed, Clara began attending the special study group led by the professor. It was held in a quiet room at the back of the library where only a handful of students were allowed to join. The others in the group were some of the brightest in the school, yet even they quickly realized Clara had a way of solving problems that was different from theirs. She saw patterns others missed, connections that no one else thought to explore. One evening, while the group was working on an advanced equation, even the professor struggled with. Clara leaned over the paper, studied it silently, and then began to write. Her hand moved swiftly, her eyes focused, her mind clear. Within minutes, she placed her pencil down and explained her reasoning. The room grew still as the professor checked her work line by line, and then finally looked up with amazement. "Clara, this is extraordinary. You have solved a problem that most graduate students cannot handle." The other students exchanged glances, some surprised, some in awe, but none could deny her brilliance. Word of her talent began to spread quietly through the campus. More teachers heard about the girl who had stunned the class with her answer. More students whispered about the quiet woman who solved problems even their professors found difficult. But Clara did not let the attention change her. She walked through the halls the same way, had low step steady, and her books clutched close to her chest. Yet inside, she knew her world was no longer the same. The spark had been lit, and it was only growing brighter with each passing day. One afternoon, Clara was sitting beneath the old oak tree outside the library, working quietly on another set of equations. A small group of curious students gathered around her. They wanted to see for themselves if the stories about her were true. One of them, a confident young man, handed her a notebook with a problem he said no one had been able to solve for weeks. Clara glanced at it only for a moment before she began writing. Her pencil danced across the page, each line flowing naturally, as though the answer had always been there waiting. When she finished, she handed it back without a word. The student stared at the notebook, blinking in disbelief. Then he showed it to the others, and soon murmurs of shock and admiration spread through the group. By the time evening fell, even more students were talking about her name, carried in every corner of the campus. Professor Allen heard about the incident and sought her out the next day. He invited Clara to his office and placed a set of advanced mathematical journals before her. These were not meant for undergraduates. They were filled with complex theories and unsolved conjectures. Clara opened one, and her eyes scanned the pages. She smiled faintly and then began writing notes in the margins. Professor Allen watched in silence, his astonishment growing with every passing second. He had seen prodigies before, but Clara was something far rarer. "You think differently," he finally said softly. "You see the world in numbers the way an artist sees a canvas." Clara lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she let a small warmth touch her voice. "I just like solving puzzles," she replied. But the truth was deeper than that. She was beginning to realize her gift was not only about solving equations, it was about unlocking doors others did not even know existed. Weeks later, Clara was invited to present her work at a university seminar. The hall was packed with professors, scholars, and students, all eager to see the quiet woman who had stunned the campus. When Clara stepped up to the board, the room hushed. She picked up the chalk and began writing, each stroke confident and precise. At first the audience followed along, but soon the complexity of her solution left them breathless. The symbols flowed together like music, painting an answer no one had imagined possible. By the time she set down the chalk, the board was filled edge to edge. The silence stretched for a long moment, then suddenly the room erupted in thunderous applause. Even Professor Allen stood with tears in his eyes. He had never seen such brilliance displayed with such humility. Clara bowed her head slightly, but said nothing. She returned to her seat as the ovation continued, the sound echoing through the hall. In that moment, the entire university realized they had witnessed history. Clara, the quiet woman who many thought could be mocked or overlooked, had left them speechless with her genius. And though she never sought attention or fame, her name would be remembered long after that day as the woman who turned ridicule into respect and silence into awe.